Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. I have a returning guest on the podcast. He's done 2 prior episodes and returning for his 3rd episode, Greg Prince. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you, and happy Memorial Day.
It is Memorial Day. We're recording this episode on Memorial Day. Just as background, if you haven't listened to episode 1 or episode 2, Greg has written a book. It came out in 2019 called Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, Intended Actions and Unintended Consequences. And in episode 884, our first episode, Greg went through how the church went from the behavioral model to mostly the biological model and accepting that gay, lesbian people come this way, which was far different than 1969 when the church first started talking about it. Then in episode 2, which was recorded, episode 892, episode 2, Greg took us through the church's journey fighting same-sex marriage becoming legal and where that started in Hawaii and where that now ended with the church signing or being supportive of the Respect for Marriage Act that was passed in 2013 and sending a General Authority 70 to the White House. And just that was 32 years of history there that ended with the church ultimately, at least from a legal standpoint, not from a change of doctrine standpoint, supporting the right for gay people to be married in the United States. In episode 1, I talked about Greg Prince speaking at Affirmation in San Francisco when I was a newly minted ally trying to figure out the space. And I sat on the back row and Greg was on the board of Affirmation, and he said something profound for me. And he said, when the church says this isn't a choice and you can't unchoose it, the other shoe hasn't dropped. It's not a sustainable position. And you said, I don't know how this is going to get resolved. But that's my feeling, and that is my feeling too. And so I've invited Greg to kind of talk about, what might happen and what could happen and what he hopes would happen to better support gay and lesbian, bisexual Latter-day Saints. I also want to give a shout out to the Inside Out podcast, Jim Bennett and Ian Wilkes. Greg is a frequent contributor on that podcast. I've listened to several of his episodes. And talk about this roadmap. Introduce our listeners. You did the last episode, but introduce our listeners to what you're doing on that podcast, Greg.
About a year ago, probably when I had too much spare time, I started to jot down my thoughts about what could be improved about the church. I turned 78 this month, so I've been around in the trenches for a while and have had a lot of history to look at, a lot of history that I saw close up and personal, and occasionally history that I was part of. So I had a fair amount of data to look back on and just started to jot down in no particular order all the things I could see in the church that I thought could be improved. The first version of that was about 70 pages. And after I'd been on Inside Out a couple of times, I sent it to Jim and to Ian, just saying, here's something I've written. Don't have any plans at this point to publish it. If you want to talk about any of these things, we can talk about them. And they took it seriously enough that last week I recorded my 32nd episode with them. I don't know where this thing will end. I hope the listeners don't wear out. But a few months ago, I went back to version 1.0 and fleshed it out even more, putting more meat into some of the categories and adding some categories that I hadn't thought of before. So what they are working off of now is the Roadmap 2.0, which is about 200 pages.
Tell us some of the new categories.
Oh, I can't remember which ones are new now. You put me on the spot there.
Tell us some of your favorite categories you're discussing over there with Jim and Ian.
Well, a lot of them devolved from the faith crisis survey that I was involved in 2011. That was something that was initiated as a response to the faith crisis that Hans Mattsson, who had been a Swedish area authority, had when he became that office, and it was occasioned by the birth of the internet. That all of a sudden he became deluged with questions from members, from bishops, from stake presidents saying, hey, what about this? What about that? Some of the questions were doctrinal, many of them were historical. What had happened was that the internet, by democratizing data, by creating this conduit, allowed all the inconvenient historical and doctrinal truths that the church had been sequestering for over a century to start to come out and be available to anybody, and often, unfortunately, available to people who weren't looking for trouble but found it. That just being on the internet, they would be confronted with this information, and initially, the response often was, well, that can't be true. But if they dug just a little bit, they found out indeed it was true. And that often led them into a crisis of faith, which is what Hans had. As he was being bombarded with these questions, he tried to find the answers because he'd never considered the questions. There wasn't a lot of church literature that was translated into Swedish. And the deeper he dug, the more troubled he became. So, in advance of a meeting that was set up by a friend of mine, Travis Stratford, in Manhattan in late 2011, that involved Hans, Travis, Marlon Jensen, and myself. Travis and John DeLynn and others did a survey that they put out on social media that asked people who either had left the church or been thrown out of the church or who felt marginalized and in danger of leaving the church, asked them what were the issues that either took you out or took you to an uncomfortable place where you are now. Within, my recollection is 48 hours, they had 2,000 responses. And eventually they capped it at 3,000 and did all the number crunching then. What they came up with was not only a very well-defined and I think troubling to many snapshot of the demographic of these people. These were not the wild-eyed fringe. These were the base. In many cases, these were leaders. There were bishops. There were a couple of stake presidents. There were a ton of elders quorum presidents, Relief Society presidents, returned missionaries. They were better educated and more affluent than the church average. So that was really a surprising finding to us and to Marlon Jensen when he saw those data. But then they also ranked numerically the questions that were taking people out or troubling people. They had one list that had all the combined questions, and then they broke that into two categories. One was historical, the other was doctrinal. So many of the things that I discuss in the roadmap are just going back to those questions because in the intervening years between 2011 and now, so 15 years, the questions haven't changed. I haven't seen one new question. The significant change that I think I've seen, and Richard, you got a better handle on this than I do, is that LGBTQ questions, while being on the list in 2011, might be at the top of the list now. I think there's been that much movement on that issue, but no newcomers to that list. And
Interesting.
the fact that I don't think we have had a definitive response on any of those, either by the church or by authors who are not employed by the church, says we got a lot of work yet to do. And if we can do that work right, I'm confident we'll get to a better place. I don't think it's going to threaten the well-being of the church. I think it will enhance the well-being, but it's going to be a bumpy road and it's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I think the ones who now are going to be at highest risk for getting into trouble are going to be the Orthodox and not the liberals. The liberals have already had their day. Those who have survived long enough to stay in the church to the present time probably are going to stick around. They've seen it all. Nothing is new on that list. If you were paying attention, you would look at the current church members having trouble with that and say, what's the fuss? These questions have been around forever. Where have you been? But the fact is, until the maturation of the internet, they simply were not aware or didn't want to become aware of these questions that now it's difficult to duck.
So, listeners, please check out Inside Out. There's 30 plus Greg Prince, Ian, and Jim episodes, and probably more to come. And I've listened to a half dozen of those, and they're terrific. And they're really important discussions that you're having. So, I've been thinking a lot about the behavior model and the biological model and how our doctrine and teachings, and I use those as the same term, listeners, were largely developed when we were in the behavior model. The only change I've seen in my lifetime or in that history, Greg, is when originally just identifying as gay got you sideways with church teachings like Tom Christofferson. When he came out as gay, he knew that would end his church membership, even though he wasn't, going against church teachings, and that's changed. But I've wondered, if we've really developed teachings and policies and doctrines around fully the biological model, and if our teachings kind of are lagging behind where we are and where the science is. So that's my broad question, but just run with it any way you want about where you think we need to go.
It's the right question to ask, and you've got the answer embedded in the possibilities that you just articulated, and that is we're kind of embracing the biological paradigm. When I say we, I mean church leaders, but we haven't crossed the bridge to saying, okay, what does that do to all the policies that were built on the foundation of the behavioral paradigm? We're still trying to have it both ways, which goes back to my talk out at Affirmation in San Francisco. The other shoe hasn't dropped yet. If you really embrace the biological paradigm, which is Boyd Packer's shrill voice notwithstanding, yes, you are born this way. Some of the brethren still have their fingers crossed. They're not willing to go to where that statement logically takes you, which is if it's biological, if it's not a bad choice, then why are you punishing people for being what they are imprinted biologically to be? Now, there is a loose parallel to that, and that is that for well over a century, we punished people for something they did not choose to be, and it was called black. And that didn't turn out too well. We fixed the proximate problem on that by ending the ban on priesthood ordination, but we're a long way from fixing racism within the church. And I think we're in the same position on LGBTQ and on women as well. Even if we were to have rather dramatic policy or even doctrinal changes, you've got an entire church full of people who are so indoctrinated into the worldview into which they were born that it's going to be very, very difficult to get them out of that. So you see it in your dealings, Richard, with LGBTQ people all the time, where on the one hand, the church may say something that sounds conciliatory, but if they look around, how are their fellow church members treating them? It tends not to be very nice at times. Same thing that we see with racism in the church. So if you really are willing to accept the biological paradigm and everything that I have looked at, which included a very deep dive for a chapter in a forthcoming book for which I wrote the chapter on biology, says this is biology. It's complex. Each variety of non-heterosexuality not only has its own biological underpinnings, but within any given variety, there may be a subvariety of biological underpinnings. You can't just put a label on it and say, this is the cause of that. What we do know, though, is that the overwhelming evidence is that this is all programmed in you before you're born. Part of it is genetic, meaning the DNA sequences in your chromosomes. Part of it is epigenetic, which means a variety of strong forces that dictate how those genes are expressed. And that can be even more important than what the genes themselves say. A third level is the action of hormones during gestation, during prenatal life. And a fourth for men is that there's an immunologic component in mothers that can act progressively on subsequent male births, increasing the likelihood that those males will become homosexual. Now, all of that is a lot of simple talk for some really complex things, and I don't want to get down into those weeds. But let me just say that on a continual basis, we are getting more and more solid biological evidence of the underpinnings of non-heterosexuality.
Yeah, I mean, that's really powerful. It sort of adds up for me as I listen to LGBT individuals. One of the analogies I use, Greg, when I talk about this space is I talk about the church's relationship with its queer members is like a 40 chapter book. And old chapters are things that we used to teach, we don't teach. And, and I don't say what chapter we're in, but I do say, so people will say, Richard, do you think doctrine or policy will change to get to chapter 40? And I say, I'm certainly open to that. And I probably believe it will change and needs to change. But I say I support current church leaders. I don't know God's will. But then I will say chapter 40 to me is when an LDS mom realizes her daughter or son is gay at age they're 15. They have no fear about how that kid fits in the plan of salvation. And right now, LDS moms are full of fear if they have a queer kid because they don't know how that works. And men are that they might have joy, and I think everybody's created equal. There's a lot of scriptures, and maybe you can mention some, just that everybody is meant to have joy. We're all created equal, and it just feels like, that's my analogy I use to just open the door, but try to be supportive of the leaders of where we are. But I've certainly come to the point where I hope, sometimes pray, that our doctrine changes because there's so much pain there. And pain to me is a sign that we're not at chapter 40, we're not at the finish line, or the other shoe hasn't dropped. So just that's kind of
two words there that I'd like to explore a little bit: policy and doctrine.
good.
The meaning of those tends to be in the eye of the user. If you don't want something to change, you're likely to call it a doctrine. If you do want it to change, you're likely to call it a policy. And the same teaching, to use a more neutral term, can be viewed by one group in one way and another group in the opposite way. Same teaching. So we shouldn't get hung up on that label. And even if you want to use the D word, doctrine, don't get too hung up on the immutability of doctrine, because in my experience and my study of church history, if you look deeply enough, I have yet to find a single significant doctrine that has never been changed since 1830. Now, that shouldn't really upset people, because those people are the same ones who would affirm by a show of hands that they believe in the principle of continuing revelation. Well, continuing revelation to me doesn't just mean God saying, okay, you're fine today and you're fine tomorrow. It means there's something additive there. And if you're adding, then you're changing. So it shouldn't upset us, but we tend to become so comfortable with the status quo that we do get upset. And change becomes very, very difficult for church members. Just look at the history of blacks in priesthood now. That policy, or if you wanted to call it doctrine, got changed nearly 50 years ago. And if you talk to black members of the church, and I will single out Darius Gray, who you know well, he will tell you and document it. No, racism in the church is worse now than it was prior to 1978.
Wow.
That's how difficult substantive change is for church members, particularly when the basis of their religious conviction tends to be certitude. That religion, for so many people, LDS and otherwise, is a safe haven. That's the one place in a changing, uncertain, dangerous world where they can go and think that it's going to be comfortable and unchanging so they don't have to be troubled. And when they find that that safe haven isn't as safe as they thought, it's a problem. There's no easy resolution to it.
Do you do you see, I guess, same-sex marriage ever being um, okay in the church? Do you see an interim step where we say, well, accept civil same-sex marriage? You can not lose your church membership. You're welcome at church. You can't have a temple recommend. We'll even perform those in the church, but we're going to keep the temple for heterosexual men and women couples. Or do you see ever the door opening, that same-sex couples can be sealed in the church? Any thoughts on any of those possibilities?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. While I was on the board of directors of Affirmation, a fellow board member was Tom Christofferson, who you just mentioned. For the first time ever, Affirmation got a meeting with Church Public Affairs. They'd been trying for years and they were always put off. I was in that meeting. It was in the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, where the public affairs offices are located. We went around the room. There were probably 20 people there, several of them being from Church Public Affairs. And for all but three of them, it was take a couple of minutes and just tell us where you are. For three of them, they had been prepared in advance and asked, talk for about 10 minutes about where you are. And one of those three was Tom Christofferson. He said in a very moving statement that I think brought everybody to tears, he said, my hope is that at some future point, Clark, who was his partner at that time, and I could be sealed in the temple. I think that would be a lovely thing. Now, will we ever get there? I don't know. I remember the story of a reporter who was granted an interview with God and asked the question, will there ever be a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And God thought for a minute and said, yes, but probably not in my lifetime. And you wonder what the timeline is going to be on this, if it will ever happen. I also was at a Mormon History Association meeting, sitting next to a Catholic priest who'd given the invocation at the luncheon. I asked him, do you think the Catholic Church will ever ordain women? He chuckled and he said, I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but he said if it were to happen, the encyclical announcing it would begin with these words, as we have always taught. So put those two things in the middle and see what comes out. Will it ever happen? And if it does, how will they treat it? The church doesn't like to talk about having changed. It's just really uncomfortable with that. And that always has mystified me because change is so consistent with that undergirding doctrine of continuing revelation. But there we are, that's the reality. I think the reticence has something to do with reverence for past leaders who, if they have said it this way, we don't want to change it because that will cast a bad light on them. Rather than looking at the larger picture and acknowledging, look, this whole thing is evolutionary. A lot of members, a lot of church leaders don't like that E word, but that is the reality. It has evolved. It will continue to evolve. Evolution is just another way of stating line upon line, and you've heard that one before, or precept upon precept. Usually it's additive, but sometimes it may be subtractive and we go in a different direction, like we did with blacks and priesthood. Now, there is a big difference in the blacks and priesthood issue and LGBTQ issues, which would include same-sex marriage. And that is that for blacks and priesthood, there was a binary. You either ordain or you do not ordain. There wasn't any middle ground. So whatever happened when it finally happened was cataclysmic. It went from one end of the spectrum to the other overnight. With LGBTQ issues, it's not a binary. There are many issues involved in this, and we've already taken some steps that in the Spencer Kimball years, I think we would have felt had been impossible. Those were the years where we hit, I think, our lowest point. That point being that if you were gay, not if you acted on your sexuality, but just if you identified as gay, those were grounds for your being excommunicated, and if you were a student at BYU, expelled from the university. And it wasn't hypothetical. It was happening, and the church was proactive. It was predatory in trying to find generally men, because that's what the scare was in their minds, who were gay and stamping that out, throwing them out of the church. They viewed homosexuality as an existential threat to the health of the church. Well, after Kimball died, we took a significant step that not too many people talked about, probably because we still weren't in a great place anyway. And that was, all right, it's no longer if you're gay, it's if you act sexually on your sexual preference. That becomes the sin. That's still a heavy burden for a gay person to carry, but nonetheless, it was a major step away from the Kimball years, where just being gay was the sin. Now, if you go into the 21st century, and I have not seen any formal announcement of this, the policy on serving full-time missions was changed. Never saw an announcement. You're closer to the epicenter there. If you have, I'd like to know about it. But it just gradually became known that if you were gay but celibate, which is the same standard that we allege applies for heterosexual candidates for missionary work, then you could serve a full-time proselytizing mission, period, men and women. I don't recall when I became aware of that, but I do recall, I think it was in 2011, my daughter was a White House intern for 5 months, operating in the office of then Vice President Joe Biden. But President Obama had indicated that he wanted to take the pulse of young adults throughout the country, and so he asked that there be focus groups. He wanted at least 100 of them all over the country. So my daughter went to the head of religious outreach in the White House and said, do you want to convene one of Mormons? I could explain the meaning of that word if you've forgotten about it. It's what we used to call them. And he said, yes, we'd love it. If you'll put it together, we'll have it in the White House. So she did, and without intending to stack the deck, she wound up having 3 gay returned missionaries in that room who were just bright lights, great examples of Mormonism at its best. That got the attention of the White House because the message they'd been hearing was still resonating from the Kimball years of how homophobic the church was, how draconian its actions were towards its gay members. That's a long way of bringing that change into the discussion of going from being gay being the sin to acting on gay being the sin to turning it into a positive and saying, yeah, if you're celibate but gay, we will encourage you to serve a full-time mission. That doesn't address the issues. Okay, what happens when you come back and you find out that the bargain didn't hold up? The bargain being your agreement with the Lord that if you go out and serve a faithful mission, he will take this away from you, being gay. And Tom and others have talked incessantly about the fact that that didn't work. And they talk about how devastating that was when they got home and realized it hadn't worked, nor did anything else that the church was trying to put forward as remedies to cure you of whatever this thing is that you wanted to call it. But nonetheless, those are definitive steps that generally were in a positive direction. Occasionally, we'll take a big step backwards like we did in 2015, when in response to the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage, the church took a draconian turn and said, well, if it's same-sex couples living together, whether or not legally married, we're going to hunt you down and throw you out. It was that bad when it was first put out there. They had to walk part of that back because the backlash was so strong and so quick. But nonetheless, they did that. And they also said, and by the way, we're going to punish your kids. This is when I got the call from the president of Wesley Seminary saying, you need to come down here for lunch because I have a question. And the question was, what was it about LDS theology that condoned the punishment of infants? Because that policy said, not only can your children not be baptized, we will not even acknowledge that they exist by allowing them to be blessed in a church meeting. What we call blessing of babies is what other traditions call christening. And it's the rite of passage that acknowledges to the whole religious congregation, this is a new member of our tribe. And this ordinance that we're performing in public today not only is the welcoming event, it's the naming event. This is where they officially get their name. But we took that away, at least for a while. So it's not a straight line in a forward direction. Sometimes it's a step forward, a step back, sometimes a step forward, two steps back. But the real point here, Richard, is that it's not a binary thing like blacks and priesthood was. You might be able to define 20 or 30 discrete steps that could be taken. For instance, do we get to the point where we say nothing if same-sex couples show up in church? We're not shunning them, but we're not openly acknowledging them. For many, that would be a step forward because so many of them just want to be there. They're not trying to bring the temples down. They're not trying to create a fuss in public. This is their tribe. They want to worship there. They want to be part of the Ward family. You could go a further step and say, we welcome you. Rather than the passive acceptance, it's the active acceptance. And you could take another step, which says, and we're going to give you a calling. But rather than that calling being primary pianist or chorister, we'll let you be in an elders quorum presidency or relief society presidency or a bishopric. So you can see that you could create multiple discrete steps, and the church could take many of those steps without having to go back and rewrite the rules or announcing a new revelation. You could just do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And how many of those will we take? You mentioned same-sex marriage. Do we get to the point where we will acknowledge the legality of a same-sex marriage that was performed in any one of the states or in foreign countries where that's now legal, where we at least acknowledge, yeah, maybe we wouldn't want to perform that ourselves, but we do honor, obey, and sustain the law, and that's the law of the land now. We haven't taken that step yet. Do we get to the point where we would say an LDS bishop who, under current rules, is allowed to perform legal marriages, could that bishop in a non-chapel setting perform a same-sex marriage? Or another step would be, could they perform that in a chapel? But then the end stage, I think, would be, can they be married in a temple? Each one of those could be done without necessarily having to do the other steps. So there are a lot of options there. The question is, which roads do you want to go down and how far, and what's the process for getting there? We have a general policy in the church that is based on Doctrine and Covenants that says things have to be unanimous among the high councils of the church. So for any substantive change at the top, you're talking about a 15-0 vote. And one naysayers out of that 15 can torpedo anything. They don't like to talk about those instances where that veto has been exercised, but there have been a lot of them. And sometimes they realize until somebody has gone on to the next estate, this isn't going to get done. But there are others where a sitting president realizes that he can do something as the president of the church and not take it to the other 14? You don't hear about that much. President Nelson did that announcing medical school. President McKay did it announcing the Provo and Ogden temples. The 12 knew nothing about it until they saw the public announcement of it. Same thing happened with the Washington, D.C. temple, where we live. We're in the D.C. state. I've got copies of the McKay diaries. And they talk there about making the decision and then going to the 12, because there were members of the 12, principally Harold B. Lee, who would have vetoed it. And he commented, well, it's already a done deal. So, and then one of the most colorful examples of it was the Polynesian Cultural Center, which David O. McKay wanted. He had a deep love for the Polynesian people that he developed in his Around the World tour in 1921, which began with the Hawaiian Islands and then proceeded into the South Pacific before it got into Europe. So he started the Church College of Hawaii, which became BYU Hawaii. No problem there. But when he wanted to do the Polynesian Cultural Center, he told the chair of the building committee, Wendell Mendenhall, present this to the 12. Mendenhall made his presentation, came back and said, President, they voted it down 12-0. And President McKay said, Wendell, build it. And it was built. So there have been instances where a sitting president, for whatever reason, decides that he's just going to plow around the other 14, sometimes even including his own counselors, but generally it'd be plowing around the 12. Is that going to come into effect on any of these steps on LGBTQ progress? We'll have to wait and see. But I think you should at least keep in mind that that's not only a possibility, it has been a reality. And a sitting president certainly has that option if he chooses to take it.
One of your gifts is this long view of the history of where things have changed and how it's changed, and then what's possible given the way things have occurred in the church. Just a couple of podcasts come to mind, listeners. Shane Carpenter, a couple of years ago, was given permission by his mission president as an openly gay missionary to come on the podcast his last P Day. He came out to his mission president as gay, and his mission president did something that most mission presidents wouldn't do. He said, would you train the whole mission on LGBTQ? We're teaching LGBTQ investigators. We have closeted missionaries, or if you're willing to be out to the whole mission, I'll have your back. And he came on the podcast and said being an openly gay missionary was sometimes really painful, but sometimes allowed him and his straight companions to reach people they could never reach. And he was super brave. But back to your point about, something happened that would not have been possible 10 years ago. That was a podcast from about 5 years ago. Kelsey Wells came on the podcast a couple episodes earlier. She just got engaged to her fiance. They're going into a same-sex marriage. They want to attend the congregation, Greg. They want to participate as much as they're allowed. They want to go to the temple. They love the temple. They're both doing baptisms for the dead. They're living the law of chastity as an engaged same-sex couple, and their bishop is treating them just the same as he does straight couples that are living the law of chastity, preparing for marriage. But they know they won't have a temple recommend once they're married. So what they want to do, they just want to go to the waiting room, sit in the temple, and do family history together in the temple. And my heart kind of was broke for them that's, they love the temple so much, but they're willing to make that sacrifice. And they just hope that they'll be welcome in their congregation. But one of the things I hope is we do something you suggested, is we just publicly say we're not going to excommunicate you. If you're going to be in a same-sex marriage, and go to church or not go to church, we're not going to excommunicate you. We're not going to put you under church discipline. Yeah, you can't have a temple recommend, and maybe you can't have a calling that requires a temple recommend, but you're going to be welcome. I've always felt church discipline, unless required by the handbook, works best if someone wants to fully return to the church. It won't help a same-sex couple somehow become closer to the church by excommunicating them. So, that's a couple things that sort of line up with your story. I've thought about, the original arguments that you talked about on the legal perspective, fighting against same-sex marriage, and how the empirical data ended up not supporting that and kind of fell by the wayside. So I've thought, my wife and I, obviously in a straight marriage, what does it cost me if the church lets same-sex couples be married in the temple? It costs me nothing. It's not like a pie or a fixed pie where I get less of the plan of salvation if they're married in the temple.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that, Richard. One is that this last week we lost a great statesman, Barney Frank.
Yeah,
And there was a rebroadcast of an interview he'd done, I think, a decade or so ago, where he talked about the fight in the Congress against same-sex marriage and how he challenged his fellow congressmen and women to say, now, how does my relationship, which is consensual with a man, have an adverse impact on your marriage? And not one of them could come up with anything. One of them finally said, well, it's an attack on the institution of marriage, which isn't a very good answer. And as you said, when it came to court cases where the state had to justify what was the compelling public interest that was being served by not allowing same-sex couples to be married, they couldn't show it. And that's why those cases were decided in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage. The other comment I have is when I interviewed Andrew Solomon, who's a brilliant writer for The New Yorker, has written a couple of award-winning books, is a gay activist, and was really upset when he learned of the church's position on Prop 8 and how it threw so much support in favor of that proposition. We did an interview that was published in Dialogue, but towards the end, he said, rather than a frontal attack on the church, he said, John and I, who are legally married, have found in our marriage a level of happiness we did not know was possible when we were single. Then he said, I don't know why the Mormon church or any church would want to deprive us and others of that level of happiness. Now that puts it in a totally different context. What do you do with that if you're a church leader?
Yeah, it just seems like the other shoe needs to drop in the way that we're talking about. I don't know how we get there.
I think part of it will be the biological argument that as the evidence continues to accrue, and all of it's going in the direction of the biological paradigm, at some point, they're going to have to realize that they constructed these other policies and doctrines on a foundation of sand. And they've got to move to a foundation of rock. That's not an easy transition, but that's what they're going to have to do. If we still had the policy on blacks and priesthood into the 80s or 90s, I don't think it could have been sustained on the basis of any argument, taking revelation even out of the picture, because with the maturation of the science of molecular biology, it became apparent that blackness was not a curse that was placed on some white progenitors. It was that whiteness is a mutation of our black progenitors. And as humankind migrated out of Africa, there was a biological advantage to random mutations that gave lighter pigmentation to the skin. Because as you go to higher latitudes, you have less sunlight. And therefore, if you have lighter skin pigmentation, the amount of sunlight you get can produce more vitamin D, and that is a biological advantage. So it was Darwinian evolution taking place. Restated simply is whiteness is a mutation of blackness, not the
Wow.
opposite. And so if we had gotten to that point in our understanding of the real pedigree of humanity, we could never have sustained the myth that, oh, blackness was a curse placed on people for, and you fill in the blank. Well, we're well beyond that point in the biology of non-heterosexuality, but we haven't caught up with the reality yet. And the homophobia and the assumption of prior understandings that turned out to have been wrong is so deeply embedded that I don't see some of the men who are making the decisions as being capable of changing. I think back, Harold B. Lee told his daughter that the Negroes would never get the priesthood as long as he was alive. And he proved to be prophetic in that. I think the same thing holds here, that some of these beliefs are so deeply embedded that some people cannot get out from under them. They just don't have that capability, and so it's going to be a waiting game. Until they're gone from the scene, those policies are not likely to change. That's really unfortunate because a lot of people are being hurt along the way. But I don't know how to accelerate that process.
I agree with that. And to talk a little bit about, I remember President Nelson being interviewed by Marty Coppins from an LDS man from the Atlantic and being asked LGBTQ questions. And I listened really closely to Elder Nelson. He used LGBTQ vocabulary, but it was, very much at the finish line that we can't ask God something that we've already been told. There was no opening, that there was more revelation, there was more work to be done there. It was a real clear feeling we're at the finish line, and I'm not going to go and ask God something that's already been revealed. And I compare that to, and you know this well, what I learned through Second Class Saints, Matthew Harris's book about how curious President Kimball was about blacks and how open he was and how much he'd been studying the question out in his mind before he was prophet and recognized there's work to be done there. And he was willing to ask questions that perhaps, obviously, President Lee, Harold B. Lee, was not willing to ask, and to be curious and recognize there may be more work here. And so I've contrasted those two in my mind, how sure President Nelson is and how curious President Kimball was. And maybe there are curious members of the Quorum of the 12 right now about our gay and lesbian and bisexual members trying to figure out if there's more revelation there. I've also felt Elder Oaks has owned this issue. You would know this better than me. It was a legal issue. He was a junior member of the 12. Even before he was a member of the 12, he sort of owned this issue, and I felt it was a legal issue for the church and not a pastoral issue. And I think it's now not a legal issue. That work has been done. And I think it's, obviously he still owns the issue, and now he's the president of the church, so he owns the issue. But I've always felt the shift to a pastoral approach has never happened. And I've just kind of recognize that's where I think Elder Oaks is not willing to go down that space. I've always, as I hear him talk, it's mostly making peace with this group of people or reminding people of our doctrine without shifting to, this is a hard road we're asking for our gay and lesbian members, and we need to develop empathy and compassion and understand what we're really asking to do is not asking what we're asking our straight members to do, and sort of at least open the door for empathy and a pastoral approach. So, any thoughts on that 3 or 4 minute segment?
I I see him as immovable on this subject. I'd love to be proved wrong, but I don't think I will be. You recall, gee, it's 19 years ago now that there was a 4-hour PBS documentary called The Mormons. Helen Whitney was the producer of that. It still is something that people should go back and either watch or rewatch because it was profound and it went into many, many aspects of church history and doctrine. Helen had me go up to her studio a couple months before it was broadcast because some of the participants in it were poisoning the well and putting out incriminating commentary on it even before it was broadcast. And she wanted somebody to watch the whole thing and then talk to church public affairs. She said, no member of your church has seen the whole thing yet. I want you to come up and watch it, and then you can call them and say whatever you want to say to them. I watched it and I called them and said, you're fine. But one of the parts in it, which was on the family and thus on LGBTQ, was an interview she did with Marlon Jensen, who I think was the star of the whole documentary. His authenticity comes right through the screen. And he was clearly agonizing as he said this. It was to the effect, we say we don't practice a double standard, but we do. If you're straight and single, you always have the hope that you'll find that person and be able to get married. If you're single and gay, we do not give you that hope. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. But it was too amazing for the sponsoring station, which was WGBH in Boston. And since she did not have complete editorial control, they cut that segment before it was broadcast. And I have mourned that ever since.
Wow.
Because it was so authentic and so on the mark that we do practice a double standard. Another area where we practice a double standard, and you've been a bishop of a singles ward, so you know this firsthand. The level of sexual promiscuity among our straight members is not zero.
True.
I have a friend who spent an entire career as a professor at BYU and told me one time that the information was that 60% of the freshman females and 80% of the freshman males had had sex before they got there. And 100% of them had ecclesiastical endorsements saying they were chaste. Now, who are we kidding? So we just turn a blind eye to that. But if we become aware of a gay couple that's had sex, oh my gosh, we want to hoist them on petards. So it's another example that we're not even close to having a single standard. And we ought to get real.
Agreed.
I was in a singles ward back here. This is ancient history now. that was 45 years ago that they organized the first singles ward in DC. And I
Wow.
was the counselor to a bishop who got it right. In the 3 years that we were in that calling, we blessed 12 babies and had no excommunications.
I love that. It's just super helpful. Um, the church never reaches out to me to ask, my thoughts. They don't ever reach out to me to have my priesthood leaders take my temple recommend, which I think is about as good as the church is going to do for me as an ally. And obviously LGBT will have a harder road, but once in a while, an emeritus general authority will take me out to lunch who's maybe got a gay grandson. And they're a little more, the couple of interactions I've had, they've been a little more open about the space. And one asked me, what do you think will happen? And I said, permission to speak honestly and candidly. And he wanted me to speak honest. And I said, I wonder if the model I have, Greg, is sort of we have these gospel eternal truths that are immutable, that God loves all of his children. And one of them I put in that camp is monogamy. I believe monogamy is, if people choose to be married, monogamy is what I would say a gospel eternal truth. And we'll eventually recognize that, our doctrine and policy around that needs to be around monogamy versus, a straight marriage or a same-sex marriage. Maybe we'll get to the point that the gospel eternal truth we're actually trying to bring forward to the saints is monogamy for those that choose marriage. Because I've recognized, before same-sex marriage was legal, a lot of my high school friends went to San Francisco. It was the only path for them, and they got AIDS, and I went to my mission reunions, and they had all died. And we had pictures of them, and I just mourned that these good men are gone. And I recognize that now with monogamy and better understanding how HIV is transmitted, that, I guess I hope one day we just have a revelation that says, what we're really looking for as a church and strong families and strong relationships is monogamy. And then we're going to let you author your own story. So if you're straight, that's going to work really good for you. You're probably going to marry another straight person. If you're gay, we're just going to let you author your own story, Greg. We're going to let you figure out your sexual orientation before you make any major life decisions. We're going to encourage you to understand that and own that before you get married. And then we're just going to support you, whatever path you feel is best. But the principle or the doctrine or the policy or the teaching is monogamy. And that could be a same-sex marriage. That could be a mixed orientation marriage if you and your spouse feel that's best, or that could be a same-sex marriage, or it could be, and we're just going to support you. Or if you feel called to be celibate versus sort of forced to be celibate, we're going to support that too. And we're going to do everything we can to support you if you feel your best path is to be celibate. So that's my song. One of my favorite songs is To Dream the Impossible Dream. That's what I hope is not impossible, Greg, but becomes reality. And I don't know if that's possible, but that's my hope and what I share privately sometimes with people that really want to know how I feel about this space.
Yeah, I'll give you another reporter story. That a reporter is granted an interview with God and comes back, and his colleague said, so any surprises? And he said, yeah, first of all, she's black.
She's black.
We know next to nothing, even though we sometimes think we know a lot. We don't know what the afterlife is. And if you look at our history, the theology of afterlife that Joseph Smith preached changed dramatically over just a few years. Initially, if you look at the Book of Mormon, it was a universalist church, and there's one heaven. And then we get into stratified heavens, and then we get into salvation of the dead and who goes to which kingdom, and that got changed around in 1836 because he has another vision, and he said, Alvin was in the celestial kingdom. How did that happen? Because the 1832 vision, which is in section 76, says that only those who were baptized in the flesh can go to the celestial kingdom. So it was evolving. We don't know how close whatever it was then is to whatever that reality is. After Boyd Packer's infamous General Conference talk in 2010, President Uchtdorf, then in the first president, had to go out and do some damage control and wisely said, look, let's back up a bit and acknowledge that there is much about afterlife that we do not know. And let's accept that in humility. That's where I wish we could be, because I think a lot of our current dilemma in the church is that we have locked in what the afterlife is and then reverse engineered it to say, well, our theology of afterlife is it's binary. Therefore, anything that falls out of binary in this life is not permissible. Therefore, it's just a temporary bad choice you made. And we've got layers and layers of that reverse engineering, where maybe we should take a step back and say, we just don't know. What we do know is let's not kill each other. Let's not even hurt each other. That's good theology to me. And on some issues, the church has finally said, we'll do it both ways and we'll let the Lord decide later, or let you decide later. What I'm thinking of is we used to allow a man to be sealed to more than one woman, but we wouldn't allow a woman to be sealed to more than one man. And quietly, the church changed that and said, well, okay, we'll let you be sealed to two men and then you can decide later, which is not a complete fix, but it's a significant step. So if we could just take a deep breath and say, we don't know what's out there. What we do know is let's not hurt each other through our ignorance of what is out there. That makes sense?
It does. Talk about our trans friends. We both use the term LGBTQ, but most of this discussion really is gay and lesbian people. And I'm thinking about back to your behavioral model versus the biological model, and our trans friends. People experience long-term gender dysphoria, which is, framed up sometimes as the behavioral, sometimes as the biological. But does it feel like we're kind of a generation behind understanding and supporting trans people? Just whatever thoughts you'd like to share for our trans friends.
I think a lot of it is that trans was so deeply in the closet that we were still trying to get used to gay coming out. And then trans began to poke its head out. And I think for most people, including me, it's harder to wrap one's mind around trans than it is gay. Particularly when it isn't just a question of saying, okay, you're gay, you're attracted to other men if you're a man. We can live with that. We get that. Whereas in trans, very often there is such a mismatch in my body that I would rather die than continue to live with the mismatch. I'm not making that up. That's what one person I interviewed told me, and you've probably heard similar stories from people who are trans. It's not just, look, buck it up and live with it until the next life, and then that all gets sorted out. The response is, no, I don't want to live. Not if I have to live under those conditions. And whether you transition medically or surgically or a combination of them, that's just very difficult for a non-trans person, such as you and me, to wrap our minds around. And yet that is the reality. there is just a mismatch there biologically that is not any more fixable than reparative therapy of a gay person is fixable. But it's not just in Latter-day Saints society, it's in American society in particular, that it was a difficult concept, but then the Republican Party, which finally lost its wedge issue of gay marriage, that issue having in part propelled George W. Bush back into the White House in 2004, because that was their wedge issue. Then they turned to another susceptible group and decided, oh, okay, this flavor of wedge issue is going to be trans.
For
And
sure.
so they're beating the crap out of trans. So that makes what was already a difficult conceptual issue into an almost impossible issue because now it's been politically weaponized. And I don't know how long it's going to take our society to back out of that mistake. But a lot of people are being hurt and killed along the way, and that's not metaphorically.
Yeah, I love the historical perspective of wedge issues and the fear mongering, and the Brene Brown calls it common intimacy. If the group we hate, the bond we share the same people we hate, the bond we experience is intense, immediate, gratifying, an easy way to discharge our outrage and pain. It's not fuel for real connection. It's paraphrasing her quote. And you, as a historian, have seen the long view of that with the Republican Party and wedge issues, and it breaks my heart. And the other thing that breaks my heart is a lot of Latter-day Saints are informed how to feel about trans people, not really from church leaders that have said very little, but what they've said is often very painful, but from political ideology. So that is informing them. And so I wish our church led on. Elder Rasman actually has a really good quote in a face-to-face saying we should love our trans members. The church has some quotes on the website that are very supportive. Now, the church won't allow any transitioning, medical, legal, or social, and stay consistent with church teaching. So there's a real line in the sand between you can have gender dysphoria, but if you're going to do anything to transition, you're sideways with church teachings, which sure still feels like the behavior model. Set of policies on that versus we're recognizing this is biological to have gender dysphoria, and some transitioning, all transitioning, whatever, can really be helpful to deal with that. So it breaks my heart, Greg, and and the way you frame that up as a wedge issue and the polarization, the fear mongering is just really, and I don't suffer. You and I, as cis men, do not suffer, but vulnerable groups of people that are being targeted for political gain do suffer. And
yeah, I said earlier that I'd studied the history, but on some things I've been part of the history. And I wrote in that book, Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, of the experience that my wife and I had of attending a temple wedding in the DC temple that involved a woman who had surgically transitioned. It was not under the radar. The bishop later gave me, because I was the elders quorum president, photocopies of the correspondence to Salt Lake preceding that wedding. And the wedding was conducted by a general authority. A year later, the church came out with its first policy in the General Handbook of Instructions on transsexuality, and it was totally the opposite. It was mandatory excommunication with no possibility of rebaptism. So somewhere along the line, somebody decided that they'd gone down the wrong road and they retrenched in a hurry. That may have been the only case in the history of the church where that type of marriage was performed in the temple, but I was there.
do you
I
know what
saw it. I've got the documentation of it. What do you do with that?
do you know what happened to that couple?
No, I don't. they moved from the ward not long after that, and I never kept track of them.
You know, listeners, I've heard that story kind of third person, fourth person, but Greg is the first person that in his book that's said that's a real story. I heard it was the Washington, D.C. temple, and I heard that all people involved in that went through the proper church channels to make that marriage
Yes.
possible.
There was no ambiguity in it. In fact, the stake president, who I knew well, when he got the first letter, sent a second letter back saying, "Are you guys sure that you understood what I said?" And the second letter came back, "Yeah, we understood."
Yeah, it would be wonderful if we got back full circle to something like that. But I just, yeah, we both feel our trans friends are really suffering right now, and we're a generation behind where we were gay people, and most people don't know a trans person. So I just encourage, I call it the trap of unearned opinions. Don't develop opinions about trans people by loud political voices. Develop opinions from listening to lots of trans people, or don't have any opinions at all. Talk about
And often if trans is the issue, marriage isn't. It's not like we're doing that battle over again. We're just battling over, do you have the right to be what you feel that you are, not who you want to love?
talk about, you know this quote well, but you know, back to President Kimball in 1978, getting the revelation through a lot of work and a lot of soul searching. Bruce R. McConkie went down to BYU, as you know well, and talked a really famous quote. Share that with our listeners.
I'm assuming what you're referring to is where he said you can discount what I said or anything I wrote about that because that's changed now. Unfortunately, the asterisk is he then went on and kept that in Mormon doctrine anyway. He didn't fix all of the racist things that were in there that were built on the improper assumptions that he had assumed. So you can give him a little bit of credit, but not a lot of credit because he never backed down from his essential racism.
That is really interesting. Is part of that quote he was speaking with limited understanding?
Yes.
Isn't it amazing that a member of the quorum said that, you know, with being so sure about where we were with blacks in the priesthood? And listeners, I agree. You understand what was in his book when he said that. That didn't come out of his book, but I hope someday that same quote will be said about gay and lesbian and trans people. And we were recognizing we were speaking with limited understanding. That said, if you're gay or lesbian or bisexual and thinking a same-sex marriage is your best path, I don't think you should make that decision thinking church doctrine or policy or teachings will change and somehow catch up to you. I think you need to make that believing it's the best decision for you without any church catching up to you, thinking that I'll eventually be within church teachings. So that's one of my hopes. But I'll turn it back to you, Greg, for final comments on these, just whatever you'd like to say in our final episode, your final set of comments.
Something that hasn't come into this discussion because it's not directly related. We have an adult autistic son, severely autistic. And for us, the question has never been why. And the question has never been, well, let's do research so we can figure out how to cure or prevent autism. Question for us is Madison is autistic and he's going to be autistic for the rest of his life. What can we do that's going to maximize the chance that he'll have a satisfying and a dignified life? So sometimes we get so preoccupied with policies, with doctrines, that we forget that we've got an individual in front of us who is a brother or a sister. And our focus is, what can we do to minister to that person, to make his or her life more bearable, more Christ-like, and not get too hung up on the politics of what's going on around. Does that make sense, Richard?
It does, for sure.
It reminds me when I was spending a lot of time with Paul Dunn, who had wanted me to write his biography. He said there were two Joseph Fielding Smiths in the same person. He said one was the Joseph Fielding Smith to whom you took a doctrinal question, and he would give you a very hardline orthodox response. The other one was the Joseph Fielding Smith who, if you said, there is a woman in your waiting room who has a problem she would like to discuss with you, would you be available? Well, yes, of course. And he said it might be the same issue, but once it had a human face attached to it, his response might be entirely different. And that's something that we need to be more cognizant of. Let's keep the human face on this and not go off onto wild tangents discussing the issue rather than the person. If we do that, we'll be in a much better place.
A great closing comment. Thank you for talking about your son, Madison, your autistic son, and how you're managing that and how those principles scale. Greg, thanks you for doing all of these 3 podcasts on our platform and all the work you've done in our church, the books you've written, the ministering, the bridge building work, the documentary you've done with PBS, and a lot of other things that you haven't talked about and I haven't talked about. You've made this church a better place, and you'll continue it. You're still writing and talking and sharing, and I'm grateful for that. Please check out Inside Out Podcast for more of Greg Prince, 30 plus episodes, more to come over there with Ian Wilkes and Jim Bennett. And thank you, Greg Prince, for being on our platform.
Honored to do it, Richard. Thank you for asking me.
Take care, listeners. This is Richard and Greg signing off another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.